Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you. We're going to get started today with our panel. My name is Professor Lisa Schultz. I'm a teacher here at the law school. I'm the co-director of the Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy, which is a joint venture of the Center for Catholic Studies and the School of Law. I am extremely pleased and honored to have the wisdom of the four people that we have sitting in this table next to me today to talk about this important issue. I am going to just introduce with great pleasure the moderator, and then I'm stepping out of the way. And it gives me extreme personal pleasure to welcome back to UST one of our favorite and most popular speakers at Murphy Institute events of all kind, Judge Ralph Erickson. Judge Ralph Erickson is a graduate of what is now the University of Jamestown in Fargo, North Dakota, and the University of North Dakota Law School. He spent 9 years as a trial lawyer in private practice in West Fargo, and since then has worked his way through almost every conceivable sort of judicial position that you could imagine. He served as county court magistrate, judge of the county court, state district judge, including serving as the first judge of a state juvenile drug court. In 2003, he was appointed by President George W. Bush to the federal district court for the District of North Dakota, where he served as chief judge between 2009 and 2016. And in 2017, he received his commission appointing him to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. So I guess that really only leaves one more court for you to try at some point, right? Judge Erickson has a long history of serving on various state and national ethics panels and is currently the chair of the Judicial Conference Committee on Codes of Conduct. He's also been active in issues relating to Native Americans in the federal courts and currently serves as chair of the Tribal Issues Advisory Group to the United States Sentencing Commission. Judge Erickson and his wife, Michelle, who is sitting in the front row, live in Fargo, North Dakota, and they have 2 daughters. In November 2003, a 22-year-old college student named Drew Shadeen was abducted from a shopping mall in Grand Forks, North Dakota. Her body was found 5 months later in a field near Crookston, Minnesota. The man arrested for this murder was Alfonso Rodriguez. Because he had crossed state lines in committing his crime, he was charged in federal court, which opened the door to the death penalty that he ultimately received. Judge Erickson presided over the jury trial leading to the imposition of the death penalty and is still hearing post-conviction appeals in that case. While there is much that Judge Erickson will not be able to say about today's topic because of his continued involvement, we are privileged to be guided through today's program by a thoughtful, committed Catholic jurist who has personally wrestled with the application of the Church's teachings on this issue. Judge Erickson.
Thank you, Lisa. Professor Schultz just went through my resume, and as my mother-in-law likes to say, it proves that you can't keep a job. You know, I want to take a moment just to really briefly introduce our panel. I'm going to, these are some of the most qualified and impressive people I've ever known. And we could be here all day if I was to tell you all of their great accomplishments, but so I'm going to keep it brief, but trust me, what I leave out is equally as impressive as the things I say. Immediately to my right is Father Phil Brown. And Father Brown is a true Renaissance man. He's a native North Dakotan, and so he and I share that. And he was a country lawyer, and I was kind of a country lawyer for a while too, and so it's very interesting. He's now the president and rector at St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore, Maryland. He's a member of the Society of Saint Sulpice, province of the United States. He has a bachelor's degree in music from the University of Michigan, a JD from the University of North Dakota, a JCB from the Catholic University of America, and a JCD from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. And more important than that, he is just one of the most thoughtful, insightful people I know. And so I'll just say that, you know, he was a fantastic lawyer, a fantastic priest, a better friend, and just a wonderful man. Seated next to him is John Garvey, who is the 15th president of the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. And that's the second most important thing that he does at Catholic University. The most important thing is he taught my daughter. She was very impressed, and with good reason. He is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame. He had studied in the Master of Theological Studies program at Harvard Divinity School. He was a 1974 graduate of Harvard Law School. He taught at the University of Kentucky College of Law, the University of Michigan College of Law, was the dean of the Boston College School of Law before he became the president of Catholic University. He also took a little while to work in the Solicitor General's office of the United States, and which means that he has a couple of things going for him. He's brilliant, but he also knows how to manage a faculty, and that's like puts you way above almost every human being on earth. At the very end is Chris Ann Valancourt Murphy, and she is the executive director of the Catholic Mobilizing Network in Washington, D.C. She's a full-time advocate for justice. And I want you to think about that. You know, when we are in law school and we work in law schools, we work in courts, we really don't have the opportunity very often to interact with the people who really do the hard work of advocating for justice in the trenches, right? You know, we deal with lawyers, but when you see the people that actually are all in all day, every day, to see that justice is done in our courts, it's a really, really amazing thing. And I think that it's not remiss to say thank you for what you do. You know, the whole restorative justice movement in this country is of fundamental importance. I presided over the first drug court in North Dakota, and I can tell you that the idea of promoting human dignity by rehabilitating people and affording them the opportunity to pick up the pieces of their lives and move on is really important. And none of that would happen without advocates, all right? Because judges are busy, lawyers are busy. We rarely sit down and say, hey, I've got a brilliant idea of how I'm going to solve problems in the world. And so I think that the work that she does on the behalf of all those who suffer in our criminal justice system just is really, really important. Now, she's a frequent lecturer. She teaches. She's on radio frequently because she's an advocate for justice, and it's very cool. She has a master's degree in theology from the Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge, and she is just one of the most committed people you're ever going to meet. So we're very fortunate to have you. Thank you. Now, I'm going to take a couple minutes kind of to set the stage because I'm a judge and I'm not used to letting other people talk first. When I thought about what I wanted to say, I thought about this because I think this is really where it all starts. If we envision a band of wandering Arameans in the desert, gathered around a fire, talking about their faith, their spirituality, and the things they believe in, early on, the story turns to the story of Cain and Abel. And from that point forward to this very day, all the people who are people of that tradition, who eventually become the peoples of the book, have had this discussion. What do we do with those people among us who murder, who pose a threat to our society in a way that we are terrified? And I think it's important as we think of that story of Cain and Abel, we look back and say, well, what did God do to Cain? Cain was banished. He was sent away from the people. And this is interesting because this is the usual response in tribal cultures. If you look at all the Native American tribes and you look at how did they handle murder, their general principle was, first of all, a restorative model. If the family of the victim was willing to accept the services of the perpetrator, they would bring that person back in and support the family. So the person would have an obligation to hunt, to gather, to feed, to nurture the victim's family. If the family said no, the traditional response was banishment. What happens to a person who's banished? Well, Cain tells us in his own words what happens to a person who's banished. He says, those who see me will kill me. And God says, I'll put a mark on you, and I will say that anyone who hurts Cain will sevenfold suffer that penalty. So there's mercy from the very beginning, and there's dignity from the very beginning. And so if we look at it, it's interesting, because what happens to the banished person if no one kills them? Well, in most of the world, you starve. Most banished people have to find a way to be accepted into another tribe or group, because people don't make it on their own. The greatest survivalists are not going to survive on their own. We look at all the people that flee into the woods and we never find them. We always find that they are dependent upon others. They steal, they get help, right? No one can live alone. All right, so that's it. So banishment is a death penalty unless you reform enough to have somebody accept you into their group. It's an interesting thing. The ancient world saw things not so very differently as we do. How did this seminar or this conversation come into being? Well, last summer, when the Pope made his statement about the Catechism, Professor Schultz and I were talking about it, and I said, you know, this is really a difficult thing, all right? My own background about death penalty cases is I'm from North Dakota. You know, nobody executed anyone in 100 years. The only other place I've ever practiced law is Minnesota. No one's executed anyone here for 120 years, right? And so when I was in the White House and I'm sitting there and the group of people interviewing me asked me, what about the death penalty? I said, it's a law. I follow the laws as they're assigned to me, thinking in my brain, yeah, that is never going to be an issue for me. Just can't happen. What I didn't know is that within the White House and within the Department of Justice, there was an effort that was being made to prove that even in those states that had abolished the death penalty, the public was in support of capital punishment. And it was to establish, contrary to some Supreme Court language that said there was an emerging consensus that said that the public was not in favor of capital punishment. And so their goal was, we'll prove by going to the states where they have the longest tradition of no executions that they will execute people. And that's exactly what happened to me. And I found myself in a situation where I, as a Catholic and as a judge, had to go through an analysis. I had to pray, think about it, study it, and decide whether as a judge I could preside over this type of a case. I went to my spiritual advisors and my priests, and I got very little advice from them. What they did is they asked me, what have you thought about, what have you said, and what have you read? And I laid it all out. And they said, you are on the path to a well-formed conscience. When you are comfortable, you will make a decision. God bless you. Can I pray with you now? It's hard. But you know, for all of us who are lawyers and judges, we will reach that point. The question that Professor Schultz and I were talking about was this: did the use of the language inadmissible in the Catechism render the death penalty and capital punishment intrinsically evil, such that Catholic jurists of good conscience and Catholic lawyers of good conscience could no longer participate? And that is still the issue. And that is the reason that we're all here today, and that's the discussion we're going to have. I think I've set it up in a way that we can move forward. And so we'll start with Chris Ann, and if you'd be so kind.
Absolutely. Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your warm welcome here at the University of St. Thomas Law School. I'm especially grateful to the Murphy Institute for elevating the important issue of the death penalty and the historic revision of the Catholic Catechism. I'm honored to join three esteemed scholars presenting here at the intersection of capital punishment, the church, and the law. I'll keep my remarks brief so we can move into the other presentations and into a dynamic dialogue and invite audience questions. For my portion, I'd like to share about the Catholic Mobilizing Network and the current state of the death penalty in the United States. I will offer a historical snapshot of the Catholic Church's teaching on capital punishment. Lastly, I will highlight opportunities to bring the revision to fruition from our particular areas of influence. Catholic Mobilizing Network is the national Catholic organization that mobilizes Catholics and all people of goodwill to value life over death by ending the death penalty. CMN, as we are called, focuses on death penalty because it is the tip of the iceberg of our country's broken criminal justice system. We seek for ways to transform the justice system from punitive to restorative. CMN works to build capacity in the U.S. society to engage in more restorative practices that bring healing for people and damaged relationships by violence and crime. Death penalty is a failed practice that perpetuates cycles of violence and rejects a culture of life. Scripture tells us that every person is created in God's image and likeness, and so possesses an inherent worth. Human dignity is something promised to each of us, no matter the harm we have suffered or caused. Animated and empowered by our close collaboration with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and with the untiring support of our sponsor, the Congregation of St. Joseph, CMN engages the Catholic community in impactful abolition efforts. CMN empowers pro-life, social action educators, and church ministry staff in Catholic dioceses, state Catholic conferences, and parishes around the country. And we enlist ordinary people of faith in actions that will lead to an end to this practice. CMN often serves as a bridge between the secular anti-death penalty coalitions and Catholic communities in states seeking to repeal the death penalty or to support clemency campaigns for men and women with set execution dates. Our work has resulted in Catholic bishops testifying before state legislatures. Tens of thousands of Catholics have committed to educate, advocate, and pray around the issue by signing the National Catholic Pledge to end the death penalty. Nearly 100 religious congregations of women have made public statements in opposition to the death penalty. One recent example of how CMN draws attention to especially problematic death penalty cases is our work in the capital case of Keith Sarp. 30 years ago, Mr. Sarp was sentenced to death, in part because a racist juror who openly questioned whether black people even have souls. Having exhausted all his other appeals, Sarp has now brought his contention of racial bias before the U.S. Supreme Court. Last month, in an effort to bring warranted national attention to the racial bias in this case, 3 prominent Catholic bishops spoke out on Sarp's behalf in a featured Atlantic magazine opinion piece, exhorting the court to grant him a new sentencing hearing. Catholics can speak from their faith and steward their influence to make change. CMN mobilizes others around the fundamental belief that all who have caused or been impacted by crime should be treated with dignity. We have the moral teaching of the Church on our side. However, shining a light on the practical failures and injustices of this practice is critical to strengthening the case for abolition. There are facts about the current death penalty in this country that everyone ought to know. Death penalty has been thought of as killing the worst of the worst. But in reality, it targets society's most vulnerable people, those with mental illness, those with inadequate legal representation, marginalized populations, especially people of color, individuals living in poverty, those who have suffered severe childhood trauma, and people with low IQs. Our criminal justice system is broken, and crime is only one of the factors that determine who gets sentenced to death. Starting with race, the haphazard nature of the death penalty has opened the door to alarming racial disparities. For example, a study in California found that people convicted of killing white victims were more than 3 times as likely to be sentenced to death of those convicted of killing African Americans. Brian Stevenson, the founder of Equal Justice Initiative and public interest attorney, authored the New York Times bestselling book, Just Mercy, which exposes the death penalty in the United States as a legacy of lynching and our country's history of racial terror. African Americans are overrepresented on death row, making up 42% of the nation's death row population, but just 13% of the total population. Many of those who commit violent crimes were first victims themselves. Psychiatric research shows that childhood trauma affects developing brains in lasting ways. These early adverse situations reduce resilience of human biology, and they change us in fundamental ways, including altering the brain. In 2018, more than 70% of people executed showed evidence of serious mental illness, brain damage, intellectual impairment, or chronic abuse and trauma. Geography also matters. Over half of the executions carried out since 1976 came from cases originating in just 2% of U.S. counties, namely in California, Texas, Alabama, and Nevada. Geography and county resources play an outsized role in the arbitrary application of the death penalty. Over half of the executions in 2018 took place in Texas. Poverty is another significant determinant. The majority of individuals on death row can't afford their own legal representation. In many cases, their appointed attorneys are overworked, underpaid, or lacking the trial experience required for capital cases. In Texas, death row inmates face a 1 in 3 chance of being executed without having their case properly investigated by a competent attorney. This is not to mention those who are innocent on death row. Since 1973, 164 people have been exonerated from death row, with the most recent exoneration of Clemente Javier Aguirre this past November. At least 4% of defendants sentenced to death in the U.S., 1 in 25, are innocent, according to a 2015 study published by the Proceeding of National Academy of Sciences. For those of us who value human life, these numbers are shocking and show how our society can dehumanize and execute our most vulnerable brothers and sisters. So what do we know about U.S. opinions on this practice? A June 2018 poll from Pew lines up with the longest-running Gallup poll on the death penalty, suggesting 55% of the American public favors the death penalty. Gallup's 2017 poll indicated a 10% drop in conservative support for the death penalty. Increasingly, we're finding that death penalty is not considered a liberal or conservative issue, neither Democratic or Republican. Punishment is not a partisan issue. This issue has growing relevance to both sides of the aisle. Catholics oppose the practice at a higher rate than the general public, with 46% of Catholics opposed and 43% of Catholics in favor. These numbers mean that the death penalty remains at the lowest levels of support recorded since the U.S. Supreme Court allowed executions to resume in 1976. Simply stated, the death penalty is falling out of favor with the American public. Our nation is trending toward abolition, with the Supreme Court skeptical of the practice, and death sentences rates dropping. For the first time in 25 years, fewer than 2,500 people face active death sentences. Abolition is within reach, but we still have work to do. The recent revision to the Catechism and subsequent statements from the Vatican continue to encourage each of us to do our part in the work with determination toward abolition, which is stated in the new language of the Catechism, quote 2267. It warrants repeating that on August 2nd, 2018, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith and the Holy Father released a historic revision to the Catholic Catechism, calling the death penalty inadmissible. This was a capstone teaching moment for the global Catholic Church. For people in the pews in the United States, it was a challenge to actively build a culture of life by abolishing the death penalty, especially in the 30 states that still have it on the books. The revision further clarified any remaining ambiguity about the Church's teaching and strengthened the global resolve to bring an end to this practice. While CMN certainly had no prior knowledge that a revision was in the works, in some ways it was no surprise. After all, Catholic teaching on capital punishment has been moving in this direction for quite some time. Over the last 20 years, Catholics have been encouraged by papal and church authority to seek abolition. Before St. John Paul II's revision to the Catechism in 1997, Catholic teaching on the issue focused on ensuring a fair trial and sought to hold in tension the gravity of the case and the protection of the common good and society. Evangelium Vitae was a catalyst to the 97 revision, saying this practice was only legitimate in very rare, if not practically non-existent cases, when society had no other means of protecting itself or defending against an aggressor. When visiting St. Louis in 1999, almost exactly 20 years ago, St. John Paul II called the death penalty cruel and unnecessary. In 2011, Pope Benedict XVI renewed his predecessor's appeal to end the death penalty, again on U.S. soil. In his historic speech before the U.S. Congress in September of 2015, Pope Francis called for a global abolition of capital punishment. I was standing in Penn Station in New York City at one of the delis in the station, glued to the television, when the Holy Father urged the death penalty abolition before Congress. At least half of his audience came to their feet, and my heart leapt with joy. Pope Francis may have said the longest run-on sentence, given that he wanted to add in all the life issues, a challenge of the consistent life ethic, in one breath. Perhaps he aimed to confuse the American body politic. 2 years later, in the fall of 2017, Pope Francis hinted toward his interest in changing the catechism, calling the practice contrary to the gospel and heavily wounding human dignity. Then, as we know, on August 2nd, 2018, the change was codified by the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. No exceptions, no loopholes. The Church's stance was now clearer than ever before. The Catechism revision solidified what the last three popes had been moving toward, that all life has value, and that absolutely no one is beyond redemption or excluded from God's love. But what does all this church speak that resulted in the revision mean for ending this practice? And what can you and I do? Today, March 7th, 2019, with the backdrop of the revision, with Washington State becoming the 20th state to abolish the death penalty, with the momentum of the midterm elections, I will posit that we have new opportunities in this work. Several states are currently waging promising repeal battles. New Hampshire is poised to become the final New England state to abolish capital punishment. Midterm elections strengthened support for repeal. Today, the New Hampshire House voted overwhelmingly for repeal. Today, 76% of the delegates voted in favor, and we will move to the New Hampshire Senate next. Colorado is a moratorium state, and the legislature is expected to bring forward a strong death penalty repeal bill in 2019. The state's new governor, Jared Polis, signaled he would sign such a bill should he have the opportunity. Other states to watch for repeal in the 1 to 3 year horizon are Louisiana and Wyoming. The most worrisome states, or shall I say the states with the most potential for transformation, Texas, Florida, California, are the ones we watch constantly to be sure they aren't getting any worse. In 2018, Texas was responsible for 13 of the 25 executions. That said, Texas elected several new progressive district attorneys who pledged to seek death penalty less frequently. In the state of Florida, of the 164 exonerees from death row in the U.S., 28 have come from that state. And while California has the largest death row in this country, with nearly 740 inmates, the new governor, Gavin Newsom, says he favors abolition. Looking at the death penalty laws at play in the states, it draws attention to the important role Catholics have as political leaders, governors, legislators, and district attorneys. It also illuminates the positions of authority that judges, prosecutors, defenders, and jurors hold. They have been given an extraordinary opportunity and responsibility to uphold human dignity. There are more Catholics in political office, sitting in juries, and in the law profession. Currently, 6 of the 9 U.S. Supreme Court justices were raised Catholic. Which brings me to my closing point. Catholics are making a difference in ending the death penalty in the United States. Our nation's continued use of the practice is tragic. It's an ongoing violation of human dignity. It perpetuates cycles of violence, and there are other ways to keep people accountable. Restorative justice calls to us to a dignifying, healing, gospel-centered approach to crime and violence. Instead of asking, what punishment should the guilty party receive, it seeks to address the needs of victims and communities, to achieve authentic accountability, and to repair the harm that was done. In the words of Richard Rohr, suffering that is not transformed will most assuredly be transmitted. Plain and simple restorative approaches interrupt cycles of violence. The death penalty perpetuates cycles of violence. We should be encouraged. The Holy Father, in his December statement before a delegation of the International Commission Against the Death Penalty, demonstrated his knowledge of the political complexities of seeking abolition. Among his pieces of advice, he stressed the importance of moratoriums and decreasing new death sentences. He encourages you and me to engage the political process. Catholic Mobilizing Network helps to make that happen. Here are 3 things you can do. I'm an advocate at heart, so I have left materials for you in the back of the room. First, make a pledge to educate, advocate, and pray for an end to capital punishment with CMN's National Catholic Pledge to end the death penalty. Second, visit Catholic Mobilizing's website, catholicmobilizing.org, for an interactive map with links to state fact sheets and resources about restorative justice. Lastly, sign up for action alerts when state repeal bills are moving, or our Mercy in Action project with calls for clemency for those facing execution. On a final note, seeking an end to capital punishment is not our final goal, although with the grace of God, that will happen in our lifetime. The loftier enterprise, however, is to establish a more restorative justice, which seeks to address harm caused by crime. This week, Michelle Alexander had a piece in the New York Times where she said, and I quote, "We as a society are not yet prepared to apply restorative and transformative justice principles to all crimes of violence. Some people do need to be separated in order to keep others safe. But if we invest our resources in the healing, restoration, and rebuilding of relationships and communities, and stop pretending that caging people on a massive scale makes our communities safer, we just might discover that we are capable of reckoning with one another." End quote. Together we can end the death penalty and find creative ways to value human dignity, enable healing, and create space for redemption. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Valancourt Murphy. Father Brown?
Thank you, Judge Ralph. And I, too, would like to thank all of you for the very warm reception that we've received here at the University of St. Thomas Law School. Coming to the Twin Cities is always something like a homecoming for me. My brother lived in St. Paul for a number of years. My niece still does, who I'm staying with, so it's an opportunity to get together with friends and family. And my sister also lives here. And it's always a great pleasure to be with Judge Ralph and Michelle. Just a year ago, You did me one of the great honors of my life.
Thank you.
When I was invited to give the closing benediction prayer at his installation ceremony to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals in Fargo. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for involving me in this, I think, very important discussion that we're having today. Theologians are debating whether the change to paragraph 2267 of the Catechism represents a complete change in doctrine, the development of doctrine, or a prudential judgment on how doctrine applies today. I don't believe it changes doctrine at all. I do believe it is a development of the expression of doctrine that began with Pope John Paul II. Actually, it began with the pre-Constantinian fathers of the church, but in our recent times began with Pope John Paul II, continued with Pope Benedict XVI, and has reached its completion with Pope Francis. And that at its heart, the new language represents a prudential pastoral judgment that Catholics must take seriously and embrace with religious deference of mind and will. Catholic doctrine has always opposed use of the death penalty in principle, but in practice has allowed it under certain circumstances. It has viewed it as a licit prerogative of civil authority, but only under the right circumstances, to promote the common good and to protect the innocent. But doctrine has always held that it should be avoided as much as possible, even if civil authority has a natural law right to use it. It has never been considered intrinsically evil, as other things are, but is never licit for the church as church to use, or for clerics to be involved in. Interestingly, Catholic doctrine acknowledges the distinction between church and state, separation of church and state, an idea that we like in our time. It's only after Christianity became the Roman state religion under Theodosius at the end of the 4th century that things started to blur somewhat. But the basic doctrine has never really changed. I'd like to propose that just because church and state are separate doesn't mean we can't talk to one another across the fence once in a while, to learn from one another, and to enrich one another's understanding of right and wrong, of good and bad, of what truly serves the common good. Good fences make good neighbors, Robert Frost said, but he also said, something there is that doesn't love a wall. The new language of the Catechism doesn't change doctrine. Rather, it states that the death penalty is inadmissible in the circumstances of today because less extreme means exist to serve the common good and protect the innocent. Since this is a prudential judgment, reasonable minds can disagree about it. The Church's judgment should be presumed correct by Catholics, I believe, but it is not conclusive. Catholic public officials must make prudential judgments of their own when carrying out public responsibilities. They should consider the Pope's teaching seriously. Catholic legislators, in particular, the Church's call for abolition of the death penalty. Judges, on the other hand, may not have discretion in concrete cases. The law may relegate the decision to a jury. When there is discretion, I believe judges should take the reasons behind the Pope's teaching into consideration seriously when deciding whether or not to impose the death penalty but they still have to decide for themselves. The situation of judges here, in a way, is something like that of executioners, whom Catholic doctrine has never considered liable for wrong or wrongful killing because they are carrying out a public function that is considered morally licit under the right circumstances. The new language, therefore, speaks more, in my opinion, to legislators and citizens than to judges and administrators. Dr. Kevin Miller of Franciscan University, Steubenville, thinks Pope Francis does not always express himself with the clarity of a theologian, and that, quote, this can create misinterpretation, confusion, which is unnecessary and harmful to people of goodwill, close quotes. I disagree. The Pope's pronouncements are clearer than may at first blush appear. I've always found them, upon reflection, carefully nuanced and consistent with existing doctrine, which itself is often subtle and finely nuanced. It shouldn't surprise us that his statements don't adapt well to a soundbite culture. He is, after all, a Jesuit, a very intelligent, and I would even say a brilliant Jesuit. This church doctrine is grounded in the natural law of self-defense and divine law revealed in sacred scripture. Pope Francis rightly anchors the new language in self-defense analysis and sacred scripture. Here, however, the gospel, not the Old Testament sanctioning of capital punishment. The fathers of the church pre- and post-Constantine all recognized the right of the state, but not of the church, to use capital punishment. While civil authority has the right, they counseled it should avoid using it as much as possible. St. Thomas Aquinas, following Aristotle, thought that heinous crimes resulted in the perpetrator forfeiting her or his human dignity. Pope Francis teaches that they do not. Human dignity is never forfeited and must always be respected. The Pope is closer to the Fathers in this than Thomas, I believe, and I believe he's correct. But this is a change in anthropological perspective, not theology or doctrine, although it does affect the application of doctrine. The Church says some actions are intrinsically evil, like artificial contraception and abortion. I have a doctorate, so I can be called Dr. Phil. Quoting the other Dr. Phil regarding contraception as intrinsically evil, I would ask, so how's that working out for you? But the other commonly cited intrinsically evil act is not susceptible of quips. The act of intentionally taking a human life always raises the profoundest questions that we continue to struggle with as a society and as individuals. Let me now address the real question I think the new language poses. Let's not focus on whether society can have a death penalty, but whether we should have it. This calls for serious discernment. I believe we shouldn't have it, and here's why. As a young lawyer, long before I was a priest, I was an assistant attorney general for the North Dakota Pardon Board and parole and probation departments. My boss was a very smart, experienced, wise man named Irv Redmond. He'd served in about every law enforcement position imaginable, including warden of the state penitentiary. He was committed to rehabilitation and prisons being places where human dignity is respected and prisoners are safe, where prisoners are helped to acquire skills needed to lead productive lives. Every year, death penalty bills were introduced in the state legislature, and every year, Irv testified against them. He was very proud that North Dakota has never had the death penalty, as am I. He had two reasons for opposing it. The first was that someone on death row has no reason not to try to escape and kill prison guards while doing so. So Irv thought that not having the death penalty promotes the common good and protects the innocent better than having the death penalty. The second reason was what it does to those who carry it out. He'd studied its effects on those who kill in the name of the state. Killing changes a person, even if it's legal. It damages people psychologically and emotionally. Most need therapy to deal with their jobs. For others, it brings out the worst in them. I think of Percy Wetmore in The Green Mile, the prison guard who couldn't wait for his first kill and deliberately made his victim suffer a long, excruciating death in front of horrified witnesses. Is that what we want? Or are we satisfied just making nice people who will be damaged by it do our dirty work for us? This happens when we send young men off to fight wars, of course, but war, regrettably, is sometimes necessary. The Pope argues that capital punishment is no longer necessary. Do we really want to damage good people if it's not necessary? Pope Francis grounds his teaching in human dignity, and so do I, but from a little different perspective. Pope Francis argues from the dignity of the offender, a hard sell, especially for those affected by heinous crimes. But what about the dignity of those we ask to kill for us? I want to see the death penalty abolished because of what it does to the people who kill for us, to family members and friends of victims, what it does to us all. You don't lessen violence by doing violence. Some people today are against the death penalty because they believe offenders suffer more without it. They want offenders to suffer as much as possible. Is that what we want? What are we becoming? Remember the black church whose members expressed forgiveness of the shooter? I think they understood what it would do to them if they didn't forgive. Isn't that who we should want to be? Or have we bought the myth that capital punishment somehow brings closure? I love that expression. You hear it all the time. I don't know what it means. I ask people all the time when they say, I'm trying to get closure. What do you mean? When all it really does is open a festering wound. I think we should forget about society's right to the death penalty and only ask if we should have it. Then decide, based not on what it does or doesn't do to the offender, but on what it does to us, how it changes us, makes us different, damages us, opens a wound that never heals, makes society more violent, makes us less hopeful, resigns us to things as they are, makes us pretend that killing brings closure, when all it really does is inflict an incurable wound.
Thank you, Father Phil. President Garvey? President Garvey?
Thanks very much, Judge, and thanks to all of you for inviting me. I'm interested in the same question that Father was discussing about what seems to be a change in Catholic attitudes toward the death penalty. Chris Ann was saying that in Evangelium Vitae, Pope John Paul II said that it was something that should only be imposed in cases where it was absolutely necessary to defend society, and then went on to say that that shouldn't happen very often in today's society. And last year, as Chris Ann was telling you, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith changed the Catholic Catechism, this section 2267, to say that now the death penalty was inadmissible. This was something that had the approval of Pope Francis. I'm curious about what happened in the 25 years or the 21 years between the amendment after Evangelium Vitae and the most recent amendment to the Catechism. I'll read you the passage in 2267 from the Catechism, and then I want to focus on a couple of things that it says. Here's the language. Recourse to the death penalty on the part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. Now, here are the 3 points they make. Today, however, there is an increasing awareness that the dignity of the person is not lost even after the commission of very serious crimes. In addition, a new understanding has emerged of the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state. Lastly, more effective systems of detention have been developed, which ensure the due protection of citizens, but at the same time do not definitely deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. Consequently, the Church teaches, in the light of the gospel, that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability of the dignity of the person, and she works with determination for its abolition worldwide. So, Catholics are now instructed by the Catechism that the death penalty is wrong in all cases. This poses two interesting questions that I want to talk briefly about. One of them is what happened to bring about this change, and the other is if the Church taught one thing in the past and another thing now, how does that bear on the authoritativeness of the current teaching of the Church? What does it mean for us? How strictly are we bound by what the Church says? So let me talk first about what might have changed. And remember that the section 2267 offers 3 reasons. The last of them I'll mention first because I think it's the weakest. They say more effective systems of detention have been developed which ensure the due protection of citizens, but at the same time do not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. If it means that the prison security has improved so much since the last revision of the Catechism that the possibilities of escape, which might have been rare in 1997, are now non-existent, that's an empirical proposition, and the congregation doesn't offer any data to support it. And had it done so, I don't think it would have any particular expertise in assessing the evidence. This is not a question of faith or morals on which they have more authority than we do. It's a kind of sociological or penological question. I think it's more likely that the drafters just meant to repeat a point that was made by John Paul in Evangelium Vitae and that was already made in the Catechism and link it to the other 2 points that they made. So I think they mean to say that prisoners who are bent on mayhem nowadays pretty much can't escape, and so we can safely hold out to them the possibility of redemption. So let me look at the other 2 reasons that the Catechism offers. The amended section begins by noting what it calls an increasing awareness of the dignity of the person. This really struck me. It was this business about the dignity of the person was a leitmotif of Vatican II. There's a declaration on religious liberty called Dignitatis Humanae in Vatican II, and it begins in this way: contemporary man is becoming increasingly conscious of the dignity of the human person. Then in Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, the whole first chapter of Gaudium et Spes is devoted to human dignity. They say that we have it because we're made in the image and likeness of God, because we're called to communion with God. And here's the thing that struck me as I thought about this. the Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, also represented a development in Catholic doctrine, and it was linked to this claim about human dignity. In the 19th century, I used to, before I became an administrator, and I still read books, I used to write and read a lot about religious freedom. And in the 19th century, the Catholic Church used to say that because the Catholic Church was the one true church, it should be the established religion in any right-thinking state. As they put it at the time, error has no rights. So, for example, Pius IX, in his Syllabus of Errors, condemned the following proposition. Condemned this proposition: every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which, guided by the light of reason, he shall consider true. Exactly 101 years later, in Dignitatis Humanae, Vatican II affirmed the same proposition. It embraced it. It said the search for truth must be carried out in a manner that's appropriate to the dignity of the human person. What we now say, what the Church now says, is that if we're really committed to human dignity, we have to allow people to seek religious truth on their own, because faith is only real if it's freely arrived at. Like modern liberals, we Catholics have a kind of baseline commitment to freedom, although unlike modern liberals, we think that the point is to allow us to direct our lives toward God. Anyway, think now about the development of doctrine around the death penalty. The criminal, like the religious seeker, can find God only by voluntary and free internal acts, as Dignitatis Humanae says. Capital punishment can't absolve him of his sins or fix his crooked ways. He needs to be left alive so that he can come out right on the other end. I think that's the first point they were trying to make in the revision. The second point puzzled me. It says, a new understanding has emerged of the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state. I wondered what this could mean. It's a bit obscure, and they don't try to explain it. I wondered, have we learned something about penal sanctions that we didn't know at the time of Origen or Aquinas or Robert Bellarmine? Did somebody come up with some new ideas? Are we more enlightened, so we now see as cruel and excessive what the Christian world once endorsed? I actually think that there has been a shift in our understanding. I read a really interesting piece that the judge also read by Avery Dulles about retribution by the state. And Avery Dulles said that retribution was, as he put it, a symbolic anticipation of God's perfect justice. A criminal who accepted capital punishment could expiate his evil deeds and be absolved of his sins and escape or some of the sentencing he would otherwise get in the next life. And here's what Dulles goes on to say. He says, for the symbolism of God's perfect justice to be authentic, the society must believe in the existence of a transcendent order of justice, which the state has an obligation to protect. That's how we used to understand it. This has been true, he says, in the past, but in our day, the state's generally viewed simply as an instrument of the will of the governed. And in this modern perspective, the death penalty expresses not the divine judgment on objective evil, but rather a collective anger of the group. It's a little unfair. It isn't just anger. At least since the 18th century, the Brits and we Americans have aspired to reform the people that we incarcerate. What we once called the American Prison Association, for example, we now call the American Correctional Association. The United Nations says this: the treatment of persons sentenced to imprisonment shall have as its purpose to establish in them the will to lead law-abiding and self-supporting lives after their release and to fit them to do so. And when this new section of the Catechism was published, Cardinal Laderia, who is now the head of CDF, wrote a letter accompanying the publication, and he said, in the modern state, penal sanctions should be oriented above all to the rehabilitation and social reintegration of the criminal. So I think this makes a little bit more sense to me now. It fits together with the point about human dignity in the revised section. In our liberal society, where there isn't any transcendent order of justice, the good of the individual is the highest law. And the correction system helps to achieve this by setting the wayward offender back on his feet and restoring his ability to live an autonomous life. This isn't what we Catholics believe, but for us Catholics who still believe in such a thing as objective truth and goodness, the commitment to human dignity means we should equip the offender to pursue these things on his own. So I think that's the argument that 2267 makes, and it's a compelling argument. But it's not the one we always made, and this is the second thing I want to say a word about. But just to recapitulate briefly, 2267 says that capital punishment is inadmissible because it's inconsistent with human dignity and the proper aims of the criminal law. But it is a change from the Church's traditional teaching. And the thing about the development of doctrine, like about religious liberty or about this, is that it undercuts the authority of the teaching. How can a practice that was admissible in some way in the 3rd or the 13th or the 20th century be inadmissible in the 21st? If you look at the central principles of our faith, like the incarnation and the resurrection, they're unchanging, and if you dispute these divinely revealed truths, you're a heretic. And we've said these things since before the Council of Nicaea. That's one kind. Something like this also goes for the sort of truths that the Church has, as we say, definitively taught that are closely connected with revelation or the Christian life. The second category might include, Cardinal Ratzinger has suggested, the teaching that priestly ordination is reserved to men. Or consider what the Catechism says about abortion. Here's the language in the Catechism. Since the 1st century, the Church has affirmed the moral evil of every procured abortion. This teaching has not changed and remains unchangeable. So people who deny these kinds of matters are no longer in full communion with the Church. The teaching about capital punishment is not like either of these. But nevertheless, as Father Brown said, the Church also claims authority for many of its ordinary teachings about faith or morals, instructions to which it makes no claim of infallibility. Nevertheless, statements of this kind call for, the Code of Canon Law says this, Gaudium et Spes, Lumen Gentium says this, it calls for the religious submission of will and of mind. When the Church teaches like this, it asks Catholics to embrace it with a religious submission of will and mind. Avery Dulles suggests that most of the teachings of Vatican II, including, presumably, Dignitatis Humanae, fall into this category of things. And for matters of this kind, the Church says that we Catholics should act in a way that's consistent with this teaching, that's submission of will, and that we should agree with it in our thinking, that's submission of mind, at least to the extent we can manage. And if we find ourselves coming to a different conclusion than the Church did, the one proposed in the Catechism, we should continue working on the problem in an effort to come out right, that is to say, the way the Church teaches. And if we still can't reach the orthodox conclusion, we should remain open to hearing new arguments and new evidence. And in cases where we still find ourselves on the other side, we should at least not make a public show of our disagreement with the Church, lest we lead others astray along with us. So this third category of things, the one that Father Brown says the teaching falls into, calls for a religious submission of will and of mind. There's a fourth category of teaching that not everything the Church teaches on faith or morals falls into these categories. There was another doctrine called, from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, called Donum Veritatis. It's an instruction on the vocation of theologians, like the ones who work at Catholic University. And it describes a fourth category, which it calls interventions in the Prudential order. And here's what it says about interventions in the Prudential order. The magisterium can intervene in questions under discussion which involve, in addition to solid principles, certain contingent and conjectural elements. It often only becomes possible with the passage of time to distinguish between what is necessary and what is contingent with the passage of time. Pope Benedict, at the time, Cardinal Ratzinger, was the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith when Donum Veritatis was released, and he too made a statement upon the release, and he gave it as an example of things that fall into this category, quote, the statements of the popes during the last century on religious freedom. So you can probably see where this is going. Popes were making statements in both the 19th and the 20th centuries about religious freedoms, we now treat the 20th century statements as obligatory instructions requiring a religious submission of will and mind. We treat the 19th century statements as interventions in the Prudential order, with the passage, which with the passage of time has rendered conjectural. But what explains the difference? Is it just that the earlier statements have been superseded? Or is it that the teaching of the Second Vatican Council on the dignity of the human person is more evidently correct? Or maybe are the 20th century statements themselves merely prudential, but not enough time has yet passed to show that that's so? And here's the question for today's discussion: can we say the same things about the development of doctrine concerning capital punishment? From the 3rd through the 20th century, popes, fathers, and doctors of the church taught that the death penalty was, as the Catechism used to say, an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. Should we now conclude that these teachings were interventions in the Prudential order? The Catechism, with Pope Francis's approval, now says that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person. Are we to hold this position with a religious submission of will and of mind? Or will the passage of time show that it too is only prudential advice? I think I agree with Father Brown about all of these things, but I must say it's exceedingly murky.
Thank you. I'm really interested in getting the questions from the audience, but as you think of your questions, and maybe jot them down so you can read them, I'm going to make just a couple observations and then see if any of the panelists have anything to say about it. You know, one of the things about being a judge is that you are frequently surprised, right? The whole human condition is more shocking and more nuanced and more complicated than you can ever imagine, you know? And I suspect that only priests and confessionals have exactly that same kind of experience, right? You know, before I tried a death penalty case, before I thought very deeply on capital cases, you know, I just assumed that things would go on in capital cases the way they do in other jury trials, and that everything plays out the same. You know, before I became a judge, I thought that there was a group of people who are just sort of bad people doing bad things, and some of them more profoundly evil than others, and they were just very much different than us, right? And so the very first shock I had in my period of time as a brand new judge was the discovery that people who commit crimes, even horrendous crimes, are just like us, right? That the human condition is all about brokenness, that the human condition is all about failing, and the biggest difference between people who commit murder, rape, and mayhem and me is that they somehow have lost the ability to control impulses that all of us have, right? And it was shocking to me, right? When you talk to murderers, and I know dozens of murderers, it's kind of like you get to the point and you say, you know, they really are people just like me. I could be that guy, you know, with the right circumstances, with the right background. You know, there's always a backstory with these people, right? And it was shocking. It was shocking to me to say that, you know, we're all broken. Some are more broken than others, but it's all part of the human experience. You know, and that did two things for me. It allowed me to look at these people who commit these crimes and not judge the people, right? That I came to understand that I'm judging conduct, and I'm sentencing according to the law, but the people are still worthy of my respect, my love, my support, in some way that you can help them to move forward, even if that means I'm going to sentence you to prison, or in this case, even if you sentence them to death. And it was just a shocking sort of development of my own sort of insight and moral character. The other thing about capital cases is I never thought about, well, what happens to everybody in the courtroom? What's everybody doing? Who's doing what? How do they live with it while it's going on? How do they live with it after it happens, right? And it really was very surprising for me to discover that, you know, We just round up a group of people that voted on a Tuesday in November, drag their butts into court, ask them a few questions, and say, you are now going to decide where someone lives or dies. And you know, as a judge and a lawyer, I didn't think that was profoundly different than asking them to decide, are you guilty or not guilty? But as I watched the human dynamic and as I watched it play out, I saw that this is a much more complicated sort of a decision than it seems at first blush. And that they are affected in ways that you don't see with other jurors. It's a high price to pay for just having showed up on the second Tuesday after, or the first Monday of November, right? It's a high price to pay. And nobody ever talks about, well, what are we doing? Why are we doing this to these people? What are we asking them to do? And as I had this experience, of course, there are few enough death penalty cases in the federal system that you become pretty prominent if you've tried one. And as a result, other people start talking to you. And surprisingly, other jurors from other cases I've run into, and they said, you were the judge on that case. I'll say yes. And they'll say, you know, I was on this death penalty case. And they invariably ask questions that are really, really hard. You know, they say, how do you live with yourself? And, you know, it's quite glib. I don't ever say this, but what goes through my mind is, I'm just a referee. You know, I follow the rules, I instruct on the law, I make sure the trial's fair, and at the end of the day, that's what I do. When the decision's made, everything I do after that is one of two things. A ministerial act, where it's going to go ABC, that's the way it is, or I'm reviewing only to see if there were procedural or constitutional errors such that due process has been violated, which is once again a very academic analysis. But I came to understand that I think jurors probably lay on their deathbeds in a way that people who decide whether you're guilty or not guilty don't, wondering, did I do the right thing? And there are very few things we ask people to do in our country that they're going to worry about as they lay on their deathbed. We send soldiers off to war, and I've known enough veterans to know that they have those questions. You know, will God forgive me for what we did in this deep and dark time, right? People I love have said that to myself and others. We do that because it's existential for the nation. The death penalty is a little different, maybe. Now, I'm not an advocate for any position anyway, because I'm a judge, and I have only judgment and no will in this area. And I try to be that way in virtually all areas that I act as a judge. But I think that we should be aware of the sort of things we're asking our neighbors to do, and we sometimes just go trippingly by it. And I know that's true because I was a judge and had never thought about these things very deeply. Does anyone on the panel want to talk about any of those issues? Anything else you want to add?
You know, I'm really, I appreciate what you were saying, and I'm glad, as a citizen, I've never been called to do this. You know, it's one of, you're right, I've been on bunches of juries, but they've always been no account stick-em-ups or something like that. I'm glad I haven't had to face it.
It's kind of scary. You know, the other thing that you notice in one of these cases is what it does to your community, right? Fargo's a little town, you know, and those of us in North Dakota, we think it's kind of a big deal. But, you know, it's a little place, right? And as this trial is going on, it generates so much heat, so much anger, and you start seeing people saying things about the person who's charged with the crime, but then this huge sort of ad hominem, deep, visceral hatred as between people who say, I don't think this is a very good idea, and people who say that we should do this and we should like, you know, sell tickets at a stadium and do it, right? I mean, and it's strange when you see what it does to the people in your community, right? One of the things that's weird is that, you know, I've been a judge for 26 years. No one's called me and said things. But when I was trying this case, right after the case was over, somebody called my house. My daughter is in the 4th grade. She answers the phone. And this person as brave and bold as they were, said, "Do you have any idea how your father can live with himself now that he's a murderer?" Click. Now, the good news is she really was not all that affected by it. She asked me about it. We had this little short conversation. But I'm thinking, well, what kind of people do this? Right? I mean, it's a weird thing. This happens in our own little town with people that are our neighbors, you know? And you got to ask yourself, with any system of justice, when we start doing these kind of things, is this promoting the common welfare? Is it promoting justice? Are we developing the republic we want here? And like you say, I don't have any answers, but it's an odd thing that's the reaction you get. And, you know, I'm guessing the person called that way is an abolitionist, right? I mean, you know, and they believe that they're, you know, doing the Lord's work by telling fourth graders that their dads are evil and probably belong in hell, you know? It's a weird thing. Any questions, though? I mean, I really want to, I'm giving speeches up here, which is always bad. Yes?
So I have a question about how this came about. So Pope Francis, and I'm mostly a fan of Pope Francis, he has shown himself to be collaborative and synodal on occasion and very authoritarian, and at times will just make decisions. So nobody heard about this. In a gathering earlier this week that was also led by a number of folks from the Washington, D.C. area, we talked about the insularity of the hierarchy. And wouldn't it have been better to have a conversation? I don't necessarily disagree with the teaching and the change, but wouldn't it have been better to have a conversation? The teaching is based on assumptions. Wouldn't it have been better to engage experts in those areas upon which the assumptions are based, and to have a conversation, a universal conversation on something that's so consequential? So that's my question to the panelists. In the area of prudence, was this a prudent exercise of authority in terms of the lead up to this? What do you think?
Just a couple thoughts. You know, I was as surprised as anyone, considering, you know, right after I saw the change, CNN was calling and, you know, EWTN was calling, and there was a lot of movement, so it would have been really helpful to have some advance notice. Having said that, I think pondering the couple of decades before August 2, 2018, I think there had been a dialogue happening. And I think with Pope Francis, I mean, as the lead up, I was kind of shared that, you know, all these statements, it's like, you know, before the U.S. Congress and other proclamations. But I also think Pope Francis's every visit he goes on, every state visit, every visit he goes to internationally, he goes to a prison. And he has shown us sort of the way of mercy. So I think that there's been a symbolic conversation going on, and there's been words that have been attributed to this, and not just him, but his predecessors, at least the previous two. So I in some ways, there has been a conversation. It's just been over 2 decades.
Anyone else?
It isn't very much at variance with what John Paul II or Benedict have been saying. And it's a little less than the American Catholic bishops have been saying for several decades. So, you know, the door was open only about this much, and he just closed it. You know, I had in mind at the time of Evangelium Vitae that the only cases in which John Paul II would acknowledge the permissibility of the death penalty were narco-terrorist states like Colombia, where the Cali and the Medellin cartel are so powerful that people like Pablo Escobar can kill people at will, even from prison, and escape when he wants to. And that's the only way to protect the public against him. But aside from that, it seemed perfectly clear to me that if he was talking about America, it couldn't happen here. So, yeah, that didn't bother me so much.
I think you pose a question that's been very difficult for the Catholic Church to figure out. In recent times, going back, for instance, to Humanae Vitae, you had an international theological commission that studied the question in great depth, make a recommendation, and the Pope issued a teaching that was the exact opposite of what the commission offered. And of course, that set in motion tidal waves almost in the church of dissent and defense, and how do we do that? There is what concerns me as a priest and as a theologian and as someone who trains priests is being so much on the edge that every statement of the Pope or every statement of a priest is given the same weight of authority or is considered authoritative. And I see how different people look at that differently. If the Pope's saying it, it must be, the law. We have to follow that unthinkingly. But I'm more inclined to want to encourage a culture that, that challenges people to think through the issues. I see the Pope's teaching in the Catechism more as a challenge to the Church than as an ex cathedra teaching of doctrine that you must submit mind and will to it and don't think about it anymore. And I think that's also been, there have been teachings where, were very hot button, and so the hierarchy didn't want people debating it and causing, so they said, no more discussion about this. And so that just makes people discuss it more. It's not, how do we get to a more comfortable culture where we can really say we're like a university culture? We're here to discuss things, and we're going to respect each other, even though we have very strong feelings. I think you can tell all of the panelists, pretty much have very strong feelings about this, and yet we're trying to engage in a conversation that says, how do we deepen our understanding? So I think, I don't know the exact answer, but I do agree with the premise of your question that isn't there a better process we can follow so that teachings won't drop on us? Like it sounds like this came out of the blue, although it didn't come out of the blue, as you're pointing out. But it can feel like that to people, and then it sort of generates this ongoing polarization that I think is really the biggest problem we face in the church and society.
My point was as much that it's a number of folks in Rome and often hierarchy. How much are we engaging with laity who are expert in the areas where the presumptions are in the teaching? And I think that needs to be challenged, because that hasn't led us on the path that's moving the church along with.
Any other questions? Yes.
I thought a part that hasn't necessarily been touched on is the nature of this change in language impacts the global church. We've been talking a lot about the American jury trial, which I think is a great forum to talk about the death penalty. But I was wondering if any of the panelists have any thoughts on either different cultural practices of execution, the death penalty, and also different forms of administration of the death penalty. Through extrajudicial killings or even special operation missions that would take place from the U.S. government targeting different people for their opposition. And I was just maybe opening that up as a can of worms.
Because of my hearing, I didn't quite catch the question.
She's wondering if, rather than just focusing in on the death penalty in jury trial context, whether or not we should consider more broadly how it applies across cultures, including such things as, I suppose I'd paraphrase it by saying, the use of drones to execute civilians and such things, right? And that isn't that part of our discussion as well? Is that fair? Yeah. I have no comment on that. That's one that'll get me into serious trouble.
I'm a little troubled about the drone stuff. I don't want to comment on that, but what you say makes me think of, I used to teach at the University of Kentucky, and my best friend at Kentucky was a man who was 40 years older than I was. He retired just as I was coming in. We used to go swimming every day. We became good friends for life. His name was Paul Oberst. and he taught the same subjects I did, so I kind of stepped into his shoes at UK. I remember him telling me, he is from Owensboro, Kentucky. And I remember him telling me that he had attended the last public hanging in Kentucky. This would have been in the 30s when he was a young man. I've often thought about that and what effect that had on the people who attended it. You know, executions nowadays are, I don't want to say private acts, because we invite a few people to watch through the window while we kill people. In the same way that, you know, people nowadays die in hospitals rather than home in their bed. We put death away from us altogether. I think something important is lost in our understanding of the reality of what we're doing when we shut it off like this. I'm not in favor of bringing back the death penalty, but if I were, maybe public hangings would be something to think about. If you run this tape, be sure you run my entire statement and not just the last one.
I think
I just a couple
Yeah, I wanna
thoughts.
Respond to that.
Absolutely. You know, the company that the U.S. is keeping in terms of executions is quite curious. Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, et cetera. Over 107 countries have abolished. So the U.S. is, you know, the only country in this hemisphere to have the death penalty. So it's quite extraordinary, the company that we're keeping. I would say, you know, the idea that compound drugs, you know, cocktails, lethal injections, that's just putting your dog to sleep, you know, in the human form, that's just not the case. We know that people are being burned alive, you know, in that practice. And we've actually, you know, sort of discussed from a tactical point of view, what happens if there is something more like a public hanging or an execution? You know, does it startle the American conscience in a way that we've allowed ourselves to kind of lie us awake, but with blinders on about what's happening? So I can't really go into further details about the rest of your questions, but just a couple thoughts. Father?
Good. I try to be really careful in public settings, especially when they're being recorded. You don't know where it's going to show up. And I'm glad President Garvey grabbed the headline. President of Catholic U in favor of public hangings. But the way I wanted to respond, I think the key to the question raising is a very interesting one, and I'll try to be succinct. But I do think it goes to the heart of a part of this debate, and actually the Pope's recourse to human dignity as a foundation. And the Church in general is, since John Paul, is making this appeal to human dignity as a central value. For this reason, you can't engage people to discuss natural law anymore. They don't believe in it. But the Vatican has recognized the way to find common ground is to talk about human dignity, because everyone believes in that. At least they'll say, who says they're not for human dignity? But they also see that as a way of opening up the discussion again that really leads back to a framework for discussing these issues that in the tradition we'd be talking of as natural law. It's a complicated question because most people today don't understand what the Catholic Church means by natural law, because they're reading it through, frankly, an 18th century Protestant version of natural law, which is not what medieval canon law is. Basically, when you hear natural law in the Catholic tradition, you're saying reason. Natural law is reasoning. It says, what does your reasoning tell you about the world that we live in? And so I also was thinking about the Philippines when you asked your question, because those are non-judicial, capital punishment that this president has called for. And so I think the way for us to expand the discussion beyond our very positivistic legal system that says if it's not in the Constitution, it's not law. Whereas we would say, no, even in the Constitution, there are principles that lie behind those principles of the Constitution that are grounded in the nature of human society and being human. And so it raises that question about if human dignity is that important of a value, we should be able to ask globally, is capital punishment something that can ever be respective of the human dignity that everyone says they believe in?
It's hard to close a conversation that is this rich, and but respectful of the time and of at least one of our panelists need to get to the airport. I'm going to ask you to join me all in a moment of applause for all of our panelists. I think they've given us so much to think about, not only in terms of the actual topic here, but with respect to the depth of the analysis, I think also with respect to how we think about our faith and how we think about teachings and how we think about how the law and our faith work together. So I thank you all very much for an excellent, excellent couple of presentations.